I'm given the responsibility of introducing our speaker today. So we are very honored, we are pleased to have Professor Jeremiah Dittmar of the London School of Economics to come here and speak on this grand topic of on the economic origins of modern science. So Jeremy graduated from UC Berkeley, and he has written a very famous paper about the economics of printing in the Quality Journal of Economics. So if you haven't read that paper, so I would urge you strongly to read that paper. That is a very fun paper to read. It's not dry. Basically, Jeremy and some of my other mutual friends have been working on a whole host of papers pertaining to the economic history of Europe. And so here is he today talking about this topic on the economic origins of modern science. So I don't think I've heard your paper before, right? This is not something that I've heard of. So we came across each other at various meetings in the past couple of years, and this is something decidedly new. So without further ado, I would hand the floor to Jeremy. Would you please give a warm applause?
Thank you. So it's a pleasure and an honor to be here. So this is a research project on changes in how knowledge production operated in European history. And as a loose starting point, what I'd like you to have in mind was that while there certainly was thought innovation and proto-scientific thinking in Europe over a long period of time that included the diffusion of ideas and techniques and technologies from non-European civilizations, the Islamic world and East Asia. Prior to the 1400s, the rate of scientific knowledge production was relatively limited. Universities had mathematics, they had quasi or proto-scientific topics, but largely they were committed to non-empirical knowledge programs. We would think principally of theology and law, both canon law and civil law. In the private sector, European guilds did many things, but one of the things they did was maintain at least certain levels of secrecy around industrial techniques and production knowledge. And by the 1600s, we see a landscape arguably really transformed with, in incipient form, our modern scientific disciplines, with the scientific method beginning to diffuse in Europe, with new types of instruments and techniques for measuring and understanding the natural world. Across the social sciences, a large number of scholars, of whom I'm just quoting a few, suggest that this is a profound change in what an economist would conceive of as the knowledge production function in one part of the world that precedes modern growth. So the aim of this talk is to at least begin, and arguably modestly begin, to think about how did this actually happen. It should, I think, command our curiosity and our interest as economists. That moving from this world to this world with effectively sustained growth in the production of ideas should be really interesting to us. And what I'm going to suggest to you is that the story involves the advent of the European version of printing. So obviously there are antecedents in China and also notably in Korea. But the diffusion of printing in Europe starting in the mid to late 1400s transforms what a scholar like Joel Mokyr would think of as the market for ideas. The ways in which ideas are exchanged, sometimes in a priced sense, but more broadly in society, with really interesting implications for how many people are in the audience, that the market size for a producer of knowledge or of ideas, it needn't be science, increases, and the thickness and nature of assessment changes. So that the reputations of people who are circulating ideas are going to be formed in a radically different environment in a world of printing, as opposed to a world where ideas were, when they were stored and transmitted in written form, were literally written on a page of either animal skin or paper. Strikingly, in European history over this period, property rights for authors, like what you would think of as intellectual property, is extremely weak. piracy is endemic. So we are all now busy, some of us, pirating digital files and movies and things like that. In historic Europe, it was very hard for people to maintain the intellectual property rights claims over their books when they were authors. So the direct impact of this invention, while certainly non-negligible, was in an interesting way muted. So if you're interested in thinking about property rights and how they shape incentives, the direct quasi-capitalist return for an author as an author of a book is in interesting ways limited by the ability to pirate ideas. However, people are able to build their reputations in new ways, and that transmits this shock to the labor market. And what I'm going to sort of argue to you is that, among other things, there's competition in labor markets where reputations built around publishing and disseminating views are rewarded. And in these labor markets, states and state-adjacent organizations are key employers. So among other things, European universities are engaged in competitive bidding over professors in a way that will look in many ways to us familiar from what we're used to today. So states are allocating resources in new ways as superstar reputations are built in new ways. And this shock changes the way some underlying features of the European economy operate. So one I've already flagged is universities. Another is the nature of European political competition. So when we think about why Europe developed as it did, what was its particular path to capitalism, there's a number of stories in the literature that have to do with the legal institutions that changed in the Middle Ages, the legal autonomy of cities that carved out like autonomous zones for capitalists and other people who are actors who are going to make investments that fundamentally shifted the economy. There's political competition and the emergence of modern states. I'm going to suggest to you that these are underlying features of the economy in the sense that they predated printing. And yet, until the advent of printing in European society, they aren't so clearly associated with the support of knowledge generation activities. And once printing, which is a technology shock delivered by a capitalist enterprise, enters our landscape, these underlying features of European society, which vary interestingly across space, start to support science in new ways. So, if this is not a literature you're steeped in, I just want to emphasize to you that the scientific revolution, while a complicated and contested topic, is arguably one of the big items we would wish to explain as social scientists, not merely economists. It broadly arrived in what in Anglophone history we refer to as early modern Europe. And Needham, who we can return to over the course of this talk, he suggested it happened at the same time somehow as the Renaissance, the Reformation, and a transition to a more market, private enterprise-based civilization. So this immediately raises a bunch of questions of, is it the rise of capitalism that drives this change? Is it the religious competition or Protestantism that drives this change? Is it perhaps the principally cultural changes that you associate with the Renaissance when you think of those activities first in Italy and then in the Low Countries? So hopefully we can get some answers here. I'm going to certainly argue that it's not the Reformation. I'm going to argue it's not simply and indirectly capitalism. Okay, so what I would like to sort of walk you through today at a high level are essentially just some economists' findings and thoughts about these dynamics in knowledge production. So the first is to provide some documentation that printing was an interesting shock to markets. And I'll show you, just to begin, two stylized simple facts, that prices fell dramatically, and here I'm thinking of the price of books. So prior to the advent of printing in Europe, books cost upwards of a year's worth of pay for a skilled worker. Professors at Oxford and Cambridge made use of books that were often chained down in the library. They took deposits from professors, like financially, you gave money when you took a book from an archive. Okay, so they were rare. If you want an analogy, think of the early days of the computer when only a large institution, like a major corporation or a major research university, had this amazing machine to do calculations. And now we all have laptops. Okay, so similarly, the book price provides an interesting summary statistic on the cost of transmitting and storing ideas. In terms of quantities, I'll show you some evidence that scientific production, at least in book publishing, increases remarkably. And then this is going to deliver us some predictions, including, once we review the history, that in this period, the pay of people who are scientists should rise. So this is in the sense in which this is treating the subject quite as the economist would. There are different types of humans, workers. You might think of them as having human capital. I'm going to suggest to you that compensation for people who are involved in producing scientific ideas and in educating future scientists would be responsive. And indeed, when we go to the data, we find that that is the case. We also see that people shift what they're studying. So you might think of the modern literature where we are contemplating which course of study to pursue in college or university. And we make that as somehow as forward-looking people anticipating a future life path, including how we will be rewarded. And finally, that universities and political competition start promoting science after the introduction of printing and not before. So to think about this, I'll go to some evidence on the pay of professors as compared to the pay of skilled workers. And this evidence comes from the registries, the pay records of European universities. I'm going to show you evidence from several Italian universities. I'm in a painstaking process of collecting from universities further afield. And the takeaway here is going to be that professor pay indeed rises after the invention of printing, and most in scientific subjects. And that superstar salaries for top science professors rise the most. So I don't know if you think about going to Europe or you visit Europe, you go to one of these Italian cities, you see that architecture. That was the center of European capitalism. The Medici Bank was like at the forefront of innovations in payments mechanisms. And it's in this very moment that top science professors start to get paid more than branch managers of the Medici Bank. Okay, so these people are making highly competitive salaries in a world that is itself characterized by interesting forms of innovation in culture and in the economy. Graduates shift towards careers in science. The quantity of scientific instruction increases. So this is sort of hopefully direct labor market evidence, micro data from labor markets and from education. And then I will sort of pivot to broader evidence on the pattern of scientific activity and invention across Europe. And here the idea is to think about measures from the history of science literature. This is a whole genre within historical studies where people have produced catalogs of scientific invention and scientific activity. And the idea here is to think about across the cities, not only within the universities, where and when did scientific activity emerge? Does it respond to political competition at the local level? More in the era of printing. Okay. So that's sort of the outline. So before plunging into the history, it might be useful just to sort of situate this in terms of broadly our thinking about the economics of knowledge and invention. And I would just sort of flag that we have a whole literature on the incentives for scientific output, which are more or less the incentives that academics face today. What's especially important is to be recognized by your peers for an idea and to get that idea out there first. So if there's a race to be the first person to, come up with a claim, there are high payoffs to being first and relatively low to being second. You might also think about the economics of superstars. So when Rosen wrote his famous paper on the economics of superstars in 1981, like the last sentence of his paper is like, I can only imagine, or we can only imagine what like the VHS cassette and the computer will do to the earnings distribution. right? So he's writing this in 1981 as these new technologies are coming online, thinking about how they may precipitate changes in inequality in the labor market. So I'm going to suggest a related, although slightly distinct, story of superstar rewards after the printing press allows some people to reach audiences much more than they previously did. So all this in the background, we're going to want to know what markets exist to verify and transmit ideas. What are the assessment criteria? Is knowledge generally public knowledge, or is it held private? Do we disclose? So this stands against a larger literature where you think about how knowledge production draws on existing knowledge. So the classics, which are economic historical, like Schmuckler's work on demand-side invention, is sort of the baseline reference if you go to Duran Acemoglu's graduate text on economic growth, where he thinks about demand-side determinants of invention. Schmuckler has this lovely quote, knowledge plays a permissive role like books in a reference collection, right? So we can go to an existing body that's essentially a public good, draw upon it to produce new knowledge. I'm asking you to cast your mind back to an era when reference collections are coming into being. They do not exist in the same way prior to the printing press in European society. Okay. So Gutenberg's printing press, to the extent you're willing to grant it the title of invention, emerges in the 1440s. And it transforms knowledge markets. And this quote from Galileo is meant to flag something of this. So Galileo is writing to the secretary of one of his patrons, saying, I didn't want to wait to publish my astronomical findings, right, lest that someone else might beat me to it. So I'm going to publish it in the form of effectively an early version working paper, okay, to stake my claim and to guarantee my income as court mathematician and astronomer to this particular duke. Galileo has become the official state mathematician astronomer after exiting his university job. He is paid more to directly produce knowledge under the auspices of the state than as a tenured professor previously. So obviously, knowledge as an input also changes. So if you think that the knowledge production function involves combining existing knowledge or accessing knowledge to then generate some novel argument or idea, like as an input, the cost has dramatically fallen. So this is microdata on individual book purchases across European cities from the advent of printing through the early 1600s. And this is on a ratio scale. It's the cost of 200 pages of a book in terms of daily wages of a worker. So a worker would have had to spend almost a year to purchase a book circa 1460. And by the late 1500s, a typical book is costing like 1 day's worth of pay. So it's a dramatic decline in this price, which I'm going to just suggest to you is tremendously salient. Like everyone should go read Carlo Cipola's wonderful work on prices and civilization from the 1950s. And he argues to us the price of borrowing, the price of transport, and the price of storing and transmitting ideas are three of the key prices that give you the contours of European civilization before modern growth. It was incredibly costly to move products over distance prior to the railroad. Capital markets had high interest rates, at least in most places into the Middle Ages. And it was incredibly costly to store and transmit ideas. So there's all sorts of interesting questions in the background about, do these books vary? Like really, are the books in this period comparable to the books in this period? So I won't, for want of time, go through it, but in the background, you can think about controlling for an extremely wide array of physical and content characteristics, the size of the books, the illustrations in the books, the binding of the books, 37 different types of content, and 2/3 of this price decline is not accounted for by changes in the physical and content nature of the books. It's like more or less raw productivity advance in cost savings in production of books over this period. This is also, I would suggest to you, interesting. This is like a Joel Mokerian vision of technological change. It's not the case that the price of books just fell discontinuously. It's instead that what printing initiated was a long-run decline in prices at about 1.5% per year. Yeah?
Just to mention the demand side, I'm curious, like, suppose this technology progress happening in 1200 instead of this time,
Yep.
when there's such a demand for new technology because of the technology cycle. Would you expect the same pattern if this happens like another time? Or the other, another way, there seems to be this underlying demand side, which is very important to drive and even technological progress.
Yeah, interesting. So certainly there's an underlying demand side. I guess I don't know whether you think that there's a shift in the demand side at this time period.
I imagine
Interesting.
it is the
So-
right time.
So I'm not sure what that shift is. So I think of the other time-varying unobservables. You think it's the discovery of the Americas. You think it's the Protestant Reformation. You think it's the Peace of Augsburg. Like, I'm not sure. Like what you want to do, if you really want to push me on this, is no. It's good. You can. But the question is, what are the time-varying shocks that are going to deliver this same pattern of prices in books and the same pattern of changes in professors' pay? So if there's this underlying need for invention and innovation, how come professor pay does not change before here? There should be some incentives driving that, and I'm going to show you essentially it's flat up until the initiation of the printing press and then expands. If it's the Protestant Reformation that everything responds to, how come professor pay and book prices vary in advance of the Protestant Reformation in parts of Europe that don't experience the Protestant Reformation, etc.? I mean,
Not denying your identification, I just think maybe in another time you still see effect, but maybe less.
I see. Sure. Fair. So you think, like, if for some reason a Gutenberg had been in 1200,
Yeah, you may not have the same.
yeah, the slope may have been different. Yeah, I'm not going to take the other side of that argument. I completely agree. Okay, so the number of scientific publications printed goes up dramatically. And an interesting fact is that the share of these publications in local non-Latin European vernaculars rises dramatically. So it's not the case that scientific literature is somehow purely the province of a Latin-speaking elite. That increasingly it's written in the vernacular. Indeed, Galileo is writing in Italian in this period. And there are many people who are writing in local vernaculars. And this is suggestive of a marketplace that's not narrowly concentrated in only church and university educated elites, that somehow it's an overlap with a broader bourgeois public sphere. Okay, so I'll first think about the impact or implications of printing for universities. And there's a lot of really wonderful, rich, and sometimes suggestive work from social historians. In English, maybe the most influential is Elizabeth Eisenstein. And she argued that one of the things that printing did is it like promoted contacts and collaboration between academics and people who are involved in trades and profit-seeking activity. Like these mechanics and craftspeople started to meet to discuss ideas, to plan the production of books, and broadly to collaborate in ways that previously they hadn't. It also provided incentives for authors to publish even in a world without copyright. Okay? So you should have in mind that if it's as if you publish an idea here in Hong Kong, someone else is going to now take your book and reprint it just across on the mainland, right? And you won't receive any royalties off of your book being reprinted in a very closely neighboring location. And yet, you may still wish to publish because your name will be in lights. And your name in lights is likely to garner you a reward in the labor market.
Do you have a sense about how reputational these scientists are from the highest pitch process?
Yeah.
This is process I kind of see someone like this on both, so I know he has started.
Yeah. Yeah.
Prior to that, how is the reputation of their market with the pitch process formed?
So their manuscripts circulate, so that's number one. There's public lectures. One of the fun things is the statutes of the University of Bologna allow students to do essentially what we in the Anglophone world call like shop between classes. So before they pick their course of study, they're able to go to different professors' lectures. And then in these universities, there are concurrent lectureships. So there are two running sequences of macro. I'm teaching one sequence, you're teaching another. And effectively, they set up like internal competitive mechanisms amongst the professors. Now, in this period, university students are incredibly mobile. So you may or may not know about this. Like the European Union has this program called the Erasmus program, which is designed to get kids from different countries in Europe to take a year of their university in another country, like a Dutch in Germany, a French in Italy. When they set up that program, the degree of cross-border mobility in Europe a few decades ago was lower than it is in this era. You have Germans regularly going to Italian universities in the 1300s to finish their medical degrees and get their PhDs. You have Scottish coming to Germany. Like people are transiting the length and breadth of this country. It's not a world in which people don't move. Highly mobile. So that's another, like students move and then the news travels with the students. Yeah.
It's kind of endogenous in the sense that when printing was very costly,
Yeah.
and who would want to really spend all this money to copy or hire someone else's work?
Fair enough.
So that would be a natural barrier to property rights violation.
Yes, I agree. So printing creates the property rights problem. Completely, just as like digital technologies create it today. Okay, so let me sort of take you back to the university in European history. So the first universities are founded in the 1100s, Bologna and Paris. And these are originally institutions, if you'll allow me, of feudal society designed to produce knowledge elites for feudal society. Okay? These are going to be churchmen, these are going to be bureaucrats and lawyers, judges, and to some extent doctors. Okay? The historic universities had 4 faculties. These 4 faculties were the faculties that you find in these historic universities. Interestingly, the Italian universities often didn't actually have a theology department. So top officials of the Catholic Church got law degrees frequently. So like it's not the case that these guys were all studying theology. Like these cardinals in Rome were lawyers, credentialed doctorates of law. So from the get-go, these institutions are supported by the secular state. Each state, more or less, has their own university. So notably in Italy, Milan has in its satellite town of Pavia, the University of Pavia. Venice has in its satellite town of Padua, the University of Padua. And the city commune or the local prince, the secular government, is the funder of these institutions so that they provide a stream of revenue, tax exemptions, property, facilities in which a university actually can operate. And they compete over mobile students and faculty. So they are certainly in a market where they want the best professors and they want to attract students. And they grant 4 degrees, 3 of which are very familiar to us today. Right? They grant PhDs, they grant masters, and they grant BAs. So it's amazing. I don't know whether we think about it, but it is a really interesting innovation that we now somehow take quasi as normalized, that we would have these general higher learning organizations that we call universities. So to underline that there's competition over professors and students, here we have a statement of the Venetian Senate indicating that they need to raise professor pay because if they don't have famous teachers, they're going to basically lose their enrollment flow to another institution. Professors themselves have early in our period relatively modest earnings growth, especially in peripheral subjects like arts, medicine, or astronomy. So in the 1400s, these are peripheral subjects. The whole crux of what I'm going to show you is that these quasi-peripheral subjects start being richly rewarded. Okay? And yet, by the later period, we have this a cutthroat academic market. So I show you one example of a scientist. So this is a scientist who started at Padua, was then hired at Bologna, then had his salary doubled in Bologna. Then he got offered more money by Florence. Then the Bolognese tried to cut his ability to negotiate with the outside offer. They asked the Pope to intervene to prevent the outside offer. They then tell him if he moves, they won't let him take his possessions with him. Okay? Then they convince him to sign an extension for 4 years. Then he publishes his most famous book, and then they give him a salary worth effectively 19 years worth of wages for a skilled worker. Okay? So a skilled worker, not an unskilled worker, earns 1/19 what this professor is making. Okay? So this is sort of an example that the narrative evidence throws up. And the question is, like, if we go to the data as economists, what do we find? So what this project does as a first step is it looks at professors' pay year by year, depending on what they taught. And I think about professors in two types for now. You could think more finely grained by precise course. But right now I'm going to think about science professors and others based on whether they teach astronomy, surgery, medicine, natural philosophy, or on the contrary, law, theology, Greek, Hebrew, poetry. Okay? So this is from these historic records of the university's employment. They do not survive for every university for every year. So the discussion that you would have with me, especially if you read the paper, is to go through this incredibly finely and think about, is there any interesting pattern in why the manuscripts are missing for occasional years in occasional universities? So if you want, we can interrogate that in more detail. But for the moment, I'm gonna focus on changes in pay within universities over time, differentially across science and non-science professors. What is the timing of that? Now, the Italian universities tell me a lot about pay. They don't tell me a lot about students. The German universities, on the contrary, the professors' records are weak, but there's microdata on virtually every student. So we can track individual students, what do they do subsequent to graduation, and trace when and whether they start to enter scientific careers more frequently. Okay, so this is an example of what we do. This is an original archival item. This is something at the University of Pavia that the archivist in the late 1800s retranscribed. So this is not from the 1500s. This is from the late 1800s that we then type up into a database, an Excel database. So we're going to look at about 4,000 professor year salary observations. So to start with, printing spreads in Italy in the early 1470s. So imagine the world is before and after. That famous professor that I just gave you that example of, his salary was about 19 years worth of earnings. So he's way out in the upper tail of earnings. And this picture, I hope, tells its own story, that there's a shift in earnings out in the era of printing, and that prior there was much more bunching, a lot of salaries, essentially similar to 1 year's worth of wages for a skilled worker. Afterwards, a much greater upper tail. So this is over time. Like, you might be interested in how it works out over time. If you compare a skilled worker to an unskilled worker, the skilled workers are earning like 80% more, 90% more, a slight uptick at the end. If you compare professors to the skilled workers, they're earning 60, 70% more, and then this big increase following the introduction of printing. Okay? So that's like high-level evidence for you. So if you go and read Claudia Golden's book with Larry Katz, The Race Between Education and Technology, they have a table on the ratio of university professors' wages or salaries to skilled workers' wages in the US in the 20th century, which they use to illustrate the compression of wages between the early 1900s and 1960. And in that period, a professor in 1900 has a wage about 3 times as much as a skilled worker, and in 1960 about 1.6 times. So these magnitudes are similar, but where they tell a story about a compression and equalization in wages, I'm showing you a story of like a fanning out of the distribution and people at the upper end getting more, which I'm associating with a technology. Yes. Yeah.
For some reason, a bunch of students now want to go to university, and because students are looking for a stadium, these professors are like rock stars, they can attract a lot of students.
Yeah.
And all of a sudden, that's the reason that their wages are.
Yeah.
So we may have very little risk in printing the same, but just for some reason, the demand for their service has surged.
Sure. But I guess the question is, my contention to you is that the reason the demand for their services surges is because of the printing. You would have to say, and you might say, that there's some other unobserved or potentially positive factor shifting demand that coincides with printing and timing. So I certainly agree that people's desire to be trained in the sciences increases in this time. And I think the reason it increases is because scientists are bigger stars and because there's more of a possibility for yourself to make money as a scientist in an era with printing. Like I think the job prospects, this is like a science biased and a university biased technological change. This is just professors' wages, every professor. And now my next step is to think about science and non-science. Okay, so here's an example of science and non-science. So the non-science go up, I don't know what this is, like 40%. The science go up about 80% on average. If you look at the 90th percentile of the distribution, non-science and science are virtually the same before, and the science have a much bigger wage in the post period. So I'm saying on average, science professors go up more. And in the far upper tail of the most celebrated and highly compensated of all, the scientist professors are making out all the more better than their fellows who are teaching law, theology, Greek, and Hebrew.
Well, to get some salary information for other occupations like, sailors or soldiers in the military, just to, show the timing, not exactly the same. That would be not familiar with the amount.
Yeah, so but I guess my thought here is this is skilled wages as against unskilled wages. Now you might want other occupations like that. Fair enough. So these skilled people are like builder designers. So they're craftsmen who have components of their human capital are like architecture skills. So they're not like raw laborers. They typically are reading and writing, but their job does not involve like reputation built through publishing. So some of these people are what people would call like Renaissance engineers. Now, I completely agree with your point. So I mentioned that their salaries are similar to in this period, they become similar to those of people with the highest positions in finance. I haven't been able to find like time series evidence on, for example, bank officers for the Medici Bank. But that would be another, like, ideally, I think I would like to think many different occupations and trace what is the pay pattern in all of them and use that to discriminate between different explanations. So,
So I guess there are two major jumps professors have. 1475, 1499. So maybe Columbus discovering America got many more people wanting to go to college.
so but I mean, I don't think that.
I know you want to attribute that to.
Yeah. So I mean, this is a fair point. But so like my next slide, this will be dedicated to you. Will be one where I show that this jump is like I cut this at pre-1492, and I will show you that like unless they're anticipating the effect of Columbus, this increase in salaries is not driven by the discovery of the Americas.
And then the next major jump, Reformation. So
Fair enough. So the question is this a Reformation effect? These are Italian professors. Maybe there's a Reformation effect, but this is certainly not the area that is hit by the Reformation front and center.
So your argument is that print actually has an effect on the increase of the salaries for the professors.
I think the evidence points strongly in this direction.
That is, I mean, it is fine if you have this argument, but would you consider also other variables that could also contribute to this salary increase?
Sure.
So that there's no conflicts between the two arguments as long as you want to. I mean, if we can control these variables, it would be great. But also, if you cannot, then we can have other arguments arguing that maybe other variables.
Sure. Of course. So the question is, what are those political and economic, university finance and university education demand factors that change in this time when printing shifts on these observable dimensions, how reputations and student enrollments work? But of course, like if there are these other factors, so a claim in the literature is the French invasion of northern Italy really mattered. So Paul David has an argument that mattered, and that drove a need for math. Why did they need math? They needed math for ballistics and for fortifications design. It's a time-varying shock that delivers a need for math. But Paul David's argument says that it should happen in the early 1500s, and it should be math-specific. Now, and this isn't meant to be hostile, but there's no data in the argument. It's just a claim, it's a hypothesis. Then when you look at the allocation of science, you actually see the increase is not just in math. It's in medicine, it's in math, it's in chemistry, it's in botany. They have botanical gardens established at all these universities. That is not responding, we don't think, to the geostrategic imperative of mathematics to deal with security. Okay? So we can discriminate between a bunch of possible hypotheses, and we obviously want as many sort of contenders in the ring as possible. Okay, so science increases more than non-science, and differentially so at the upper tail of the income distribution. So the next thing I do is I look at a few examples which think about what is the timing of these increases, like in terms of a regression analysis. First, just looking at, this is the salary premium in levels. So this is how much is an individual paid relative to the wage of a skilled worker. When does this go up? Controlling for what university, controlling for what faculty, and then comparing science in the post period. So after printing is set up in Italy, do these Italian professors who are professors of science earn more? It appears that they actually earn substantially more. I mean, beyond just the world of claims about statistical significance, these are very large quantitative measures of the variation in these salaries. Okay. So this is just thinking about descriptively, just parsing out the variation in these individuals' earnings and looking at the timing of the earnings for two different types of professors, a science and a non-science. This thinks about how science looks relative to underlying trends. So effectively what we're showing you here, what I'm showing you is that there's an increase in the level of pay to scientists in the post-period relative to overall pay in the post-period, relative to some underlying advantage that scientists may or may not have. So this is like, in general, are medical professors or mathematics professors paid more? Yes, but in the period afterwards, they're paid even more. And this is relative to some underlying trend that all salaries are following. And here we're going to say underlying trend specific to science. And here we can test for a post-period trend for science, which we don't find much evidence of. So it's mainly look like a big shift in the level of the pay to scientists in this sort of, like, this is obviously imposing some functional form assumptions. Like, we're imagining that we can control linearly for the trend of salaries. You might not want to control linearly. You can go back to variants of the previous exhibit, which think about salaries varying period by period. Okay? So my hope is that I've sort of suggested to you some strong evidence that after printing arrives, the salaries of professors generically go up dramatically, and the salaries of scientists differentially so. Okay, step back. We read economic history, some of us. You think about contributions like Robert Allen's, people who are trying to describe grand transitions in the European economy. Much of this literature involves producing data on wages. They use the wage as a summary statistic to think about well-being and living standards in economies. Where that literature has disaggregated, it's thought about unskilled workers and skilled workers, which are the skilled workers in my analysis. One of the contributions of this sort of research is to think about another cut of the labor market, like the highly, highly skilled, the people who get their employment in universities and have doctorates. And here we're seeing that these people, who are an admittedly extremely small number of people in European society, that their pay is moving in really dramatic ways as a technology is introduced. Which potentially, like, I mean, I'm trying to sell it to you, but it's like potentially really interesting to think about a new technology that drives big variation in the incomes that the most highly trained a society produces earn. Yeah?
Today, when we observe this technological change, we see the star computer scientists move from university
Yeah.
to industry.
Yeah, it's horrible.
Do you have a similar idea at that time? Like,
Maybe. I mean, so I was thinking about this. I did another paper that had a machine learning thing that I essentially borrowed from Matt Taddy, who's at the University of Chicago. So he's a statistician, but he also works considerably on the side for eBay, designing like their auction interface. So obviously, he earns as a professor at the University of Chicago Business School. He's also earning from eBay. And like a statistician like him before the internet would have had a different earning profile than himself now, where these platform capitalist enterprises offer an amazing return to that type of statistical preparation. So I would imagine, presumably, yeah, we would see, like, why should I be at Imperial College when I can go for work for Google, right? Unless I cared about knowledge. Yeah.
I think science in the 70s is a typical concept, right? Science is not coming around.
Say what?
Science.
Yeah.
In Norway, in the 70s,
Factor specific?
faculty.
Faculty? No. Okay. So medicine is in science, and arts has both scientists and non-science. So in the arts faculty, you have the professors of Hebrew, Greek, poetry, rhetoric, and you have the professors of astronomy, mathematics, and natural philosophy. So the only faculty with variation in science is arts. Yeah?
I can imagine that if the income level increase in the society, the demands for books and knowledge will be increased just for fun. You
Yep.
read books for fun, not for
Yep.
producing economic value.
Yep.
On the other hand, an entrepreneur may have a very good, great idea to change knowledge into economic value. So in this case of 1,400 productivity?
So you're asking me a hard question, which I would assume you know that I can't answer one way or the other, right? So obviously consumers are purchasing books for the pleasure that they offer. Obviously some consumers are purchasing books like in some instrumental way because they help them in their productive endeavors, like really as if it's an input into production. But there's both, and probably if we're honest with ourselves, books often contain a mix of both things. So like it could be a pleasure for me as an architect to read about an invention in architectural design that is currently diffusing in Italy, in which I live, right? So that's my attempt to not offer you a definitive consumption or like input.
More income
What's that?
to believe as the underlying factor. Which one?
Well, I guess it depends on the type of books. Like so I'm actually not looking at books at all in this project. I've looked at books in detail in other projects, and you can imagine like the motivations to purchase different types of literature vary with the literature. So there's a huge amount of popular poetry. So that's clearly bought for pleasure. There's also a huge amount of merchants' manuals which teach people how to compute interest rates, to organize a profit-sharing agreement, and how to use new innovations in finance. So people are by and large not reading those for pleasure, but because they're business people who want to understand how they conduct affairs. So those are like inputs.
This is before the Industrial Revolution.
Yes.
I guess a lot of the science books do not have direct theory.
So I'll get to you in a second. So actually a surprising number do. A surprising number do. Okay, so one question was like, well, are people also changing what they're studying? Like, what is the supply of education? What are student choices in terms of which fields they're studying? So this is just the share of professors teaching scientific subjects. So that also goes up. Overall, the number of students entering these universities is more or less smoothly increasing. And several universities are coming online over this time. So it's not the case that Europe just has a given fixed set of universities. There's increasing foundation of universities over this time period. So if you want to draw parallels to like the Golden and Katz's work on the race between technology and education, here's another case in which it seems like there's a shift in supply, but whatever else is happening when you think about prices as an equilibrium outcome, the price of science is going up, even though you are making more proto-scientists. Okay, so microdata on careers from Germany. This is just one more heuristic from another part of Europe. So here we have rich data on what students actually have done after they graduate. So 28,000 German students who graduated between 1400 and the mid-1500s, and trace like what share of them go and do scientific things. So an incredibly small share, less than 1% go do scientific stuff. So that one version of your takeaway from this is science is tiny. Still most people go work for the state or for the church. And yet there's a kink here. And if you wish to do like trend break tests or flexibly imagine what might be a moment when it changes in and around the diffusion of printing. The Reformation is here.
So, is there a possibility that the printing of the Bible actually is another factor that has motivated the increase in the need for scientific research and professorship? And would that actually this combination of events that has
I don't think that's likely. So, like, first of all, most of the Bible production starts with the Reformation that's out here. So it postdates this change, okay? And like, in effect, the aim of this paper, of this picture, is to say, you audience think Germany and the Reformation. This is where the Reformation began. This change predates the Reformation. If you want to go deeper, the change is slightly more pronounced in the subset of universities that subsequently adopt Protestantism. What does that tell you? That Protestantism was differentially chosen where there was more science ex ante. So in effect, if you wanted to push me, I would turn your causal chain the other direction, say science and intellectual innovation in general is more in evidence where, shockingly, people choose a new religion subsequently. What are the shades? This is like a confidence interval.
I thought you just calculated the percentage of people who go to Catholic Korea.
Yeah, I could do that. So this is a flexible local regression, but I could just give you a raw count. So this is just a local regression. Yeah.
Based on what you show, I see there is a big similarity between the printing and what happened now in the modern day, like YouTube or Amazon. Like YouTube produce a lot of self-established star key influencer, and Amazon allow a lot of the growth of a lot of self-publishing authors. So what my point is, because those two provide a platform for people to express themselves, to be recognized, to make their name. So my argument is printing is not the main factor. May not be the main factor. It's just like a platform or a tool that's developed or invented at the right time that capture on a resident behavior or mindset, or some people were looking at the same time. So for example, maybe during this period of time, the queen may be give open night shift, or professor, if you professor presiding, you maybe go up to high society. Like maybe there's some underlying social or cultural.
Sure. So sure.
Right. So because if printing, because if printing did very well express all the names, but if it's true, then all of the faculty of all of the science and non-science subjects would have grown at the same time. So my question is, why only science?
So there's a good question. So there's science connects with a bourgeois public sphere differentially than the other competitor or alternate domains of knowledge. So your alternate domains of knowledge fundamentally would be law, in which innovation is threatening for political economy reasons, because law is what supports the state and an existing elite. And the other dimension is religion, and is sensitive for similar reasons. And only with the Protestant Reformation does the monopoly of the ideological monopoly of the Catholic Church get punctured. So there are arguably different logics in different knowledge domains, because knowledge domains aren't innocent for the political economy arrangements of a society. Now, science is not exactly innocent, but it has a different valence in that regard. And in addition, science connects with worldly concerns in a broader reading public in specific, unique ways, partly because it is practical, and I'll show you that in a second. Okay, so taking this beyond the university, what happened in early modern Europe is not narrowly an ivory tower academic change in thinking, and that's actually hugely important, that the thought innovations in this time encompassed some stuff that, like the school child history of the scientific revolution privileges, like astronomy, like Copernicus, Galileo. They are sort of the forefront of how many of us had our first brush with thinking about the scientific revolution. But it also involved popular science and technological knowledge that reached into the crafts and applied industry. And these things were not historically so separate. So, these are sort of fun examples that Galileo made and sold telescopes to supplement his professorial income. Copernicus worked as the administrator of agricultural plantations, in effect, in Eastern Europe, while they were conducting these scientific researches that, in many ways, are just shockingly innovative. Okay, so this separation or dichotomy between thinkers and makers is starting to break down in this time frame. So I'm going to study or show you some evidence on across Europe, no longer just in the universities, activities and locations for men of science. So by design, by construction, we're thinking about individuals who are known to us from the historic record. And that is not taking away from the sort of anonymous innovation that characterized earlier time periods, or to some extent the same time period. There are forms of innovation in the Middle Ages that are really important. So I guess let me just take the moment to emphasize this. Europe in the Middle Ages transformed its economy for marshaling power. Like, in a fundamental way, they harnessed water and wind. That had not been done previously in that part of the world. That's like a huge transformation in technology and associated and knowledge transformation, but it's essentially largely in the rural sector, and it's largely anonymous. That's not what I'm going to study. I'm not saying that it doesn't matter. Okay? Imports, imports, you guys could have a say about how Europe absorbed the innovations that other cultural traditions and economic traditions produced. Okay, so scientific and technical publishing. So there is a remarkable outpouring of technical literature on applied and practical processes in this period. And that in itself is an interesting and important fact. The fact that people were writing and buying these books is at least prima facie evidence that they wanted the knowledge and they cared about new ways of producing. Okay, so this is a new genre of literature that includes craft techniques. One example is like sort of recipes for stain removal recipes. So you read a book that's full of stain removal recipes, and like one temptation is to scoff. Like, this seems so mundane. But in a world where you have very few changes of clothes, like there could actually be a relatively large like welfare implication of being able to remove stains. So I want to sort of suggest to you that like how we think about the welfare implications of innovations and really like what the price index is that you should use to evaluate living standards is not innocent. It's very hard to think about capturing the effect of these things. Okay. So I'm going to look at two pieces of evidence here. Let me just finish here. This is back to the earlier question of timing, that printing leads other changes. So the changes in printing are observed before the scientific laboratories were built, before the key telescopes and microscopes were invented, before the Italian scientific societies appeared. So arguably, these are also among the outcomes of this technological change. Okay, so I'm going to turn now to a different body of evidence that allows us sort of as a group to think about variation across Europe, where your unit of analysis is going to be the city. And I'm going to ask questions that effectively amount to: where are individual scientists active? Are they in universities or not? Even if they're in a university town, are they employed by a university or not? And where are inventions observed? Where are new ways of manipulating metallurgy, chemicals, spinning? Where do these things seem like they pop up in time and space? And I'm going to use two sources from the historical literature of science, the German historical literature of science, a handbook of biographies of scientists, which is remarkable in that it includes everyone in what is otherwise the sort of master dictionary of scientific biography in English, and more. And I'm going to use a source that catalogs major innovations and inventions. So these are discoveries that include discoveries that are brought to Europe from other places, including from the Americas. Okay. So to summarize these data, what they tell you is that there's an increase in the observed number of major innovations and the observed number of major scientists that date from the mid-1400s. Interestingly, there seems like an initial period of a potential run-up, which is cut with the Black Death. So the Black Death in the mid-1300s, you might entertain a counterfactual, absent this, it goes up. Like if you really wanted to push on this, you would say, maybe it was going up anyways. It's not really printing. Yeah.
Also, that due to the printing development, then the media information and that can be recorded.
Yes. So of course. So the one question is like, whereas I have shown you university professors, where one of the key features of that data is it's not selectively observed. It's administrative data on salaries that are recorded. Here, you're like, well, maybe this is just differentially recorded in the era of printing. Okay? So then I'll show you a couple exercises where it's like restrict to the set of cities that have printing. In the printing era, do certain features of those cities start to be associated with printing? But I'm certainly not going to take a hard counter to that question. Like it could be selectively recorded.
You can also use Wikipedia data on all the famous people.
Yeah.
Including NonScience. I wonder whether you think if you observe this impact for those like non-scientists, or will you actually would like to see a different pattern? The Wikipedia has this celebrity of all types of people. You know their birth, their death.
Yeah. So I saw a paper that used that data, and what it showed was essentially after the advent of printing, like a level shift. And essentially that started to, I don't know whether they're right or they're wrong, but that suggested that to me that it's recording. Like I would have thought this pattern is in keeping with what we see in the professor's salaries, that there's a shift that has them growing subsequently. But I don't know. I mean, I guess I would need to look at the Wikipedia data. And then you would want to presumably think about what factors besides printing would predict achievement or fame in different fields. Of famousness. Okay. Noted for future reflection. Okay, so to give you a flavor of what these data are, here are some examples in different fields. So there's like astronomy, biology, chemistry, math, medicine, and so on. So processes include like making Murano glass, the introduction of oil paint, the pocket watch. These are like a range of interesting new ways of manipulating or understanding the natural world, which entered European society at different times. And so what I'm going to do is think about an overall time pattern. I've already showed you like the time series variation is that it increases after the mid-1400s. And the next exercise is to think about whether or not, differentially so, in places that have other characteristics. And this is sort of returning to some of your questions about what about other underlying features of European society. And I'm going to walk through sort of the two leading features, the universities and the political competition, which have been argued as key drivers. And I'll show you some evidence that they appear in these data as drivers of technology and of scientific activity after printing and not before. Okay. So the first exercise prior to that is thinking about a subset of cities, essentially, where you might think that the arrival of printing is plausibly exogenous. So it's cities that, by dint of the diffusion process, from where Gutenberg and his initial business partners first set up the printing press, were more likely to get a printing press than others. And that's essentially cities that were close to where Gutenberg was based. The European history is, again, like a delight. So in the 1460s, there was a war between two people who claimed to be the Archbishop of Mainz. So Mainz is where Gutenberg was based. And they literally had a military conflict to be the head church official of that city. And the person who won that war was not favored by most of the printers in Mainz. So a large number of people essentially were internal religious political exiles. So it's at that moment that many of Gutenberg's intimates leave Mainz and start setting up shop elsewhere. Okay, so this is sort of giving us some of this variation in which cities adopt printing. Now, obviously, some cities are always going to adopt printing. Venice is always going to adopt printing. Like if you were to sort of think about Steve Pischke and Josh Angrist and compliers and never takers and always takers, this is going to capture some variation in that subset of cities that are compliers, for whom distance matters. Venice is always going to get a printing press. Right? They are not going to comply on distance. Okay. So this is looking at the geography of innovation over time as it relates to distance from where Gutenberg was based. And like the picture tells its story, which is that distance from Gutenberg is not associated with a variation in innovation until the 1500s, and subsequently it is. Now, this potentially could still be selective recording, like to the extent that you think the printing press is showing up in these places quasi-exogenously and not changing anything, only changing the recording of local scientists. That would be your counter. Okay, so in the last few minutes, let me tell you about how printing interacted with university and politics. So the politics is really interesting, that these nobles were competing to sponsor scientists. This is sort of a return to this argument about the European state system being different. Those of you who are interested in sort of these grand comparisons between Europe and China, this sort of political fragmentation of Europe is often offered as a key explanatory factor. This paper connects some of these arguments with one dimension on which political competition influenced the economy, the sponsorship of research. So we'll look at career activities of academic and non-academic, math and non-math scientists. We'll look at, I guess I will skip over patronage. We'll look at universities and political fragmentation. So essentially, I'm going to think about whether cities are endowed with universities, whether they have political capitals, and whether or not they're in places where their political landscape is more fragmented, which is suggestive of or a proxy for political competition. Okay, so essentially 3 dimensions of locations. When are they correlated with outcomes? Okay. So I'm going to look at innovations in scientists. When does having a university matter for science? When does having a royal court matter for science? And when does political fragmentation matter for science? And I guess on some level, this is, now you can anticipate what I'm going to show you, is that in the period after the diffusion of the printing press in Europe, these characteristics are strongly associated with having more inventions recorded in the history of science literature. Interestingly, much of this is just on being in the post period rather than the city level industrial organization of printing. So for every city, I record whether that individual city has a printer and whether or not it has more than a monopoly. That potentially could be really interesting. I find here it interacts only with the political fragmentation variable. So I would sort of advertise that I have related work looking at the price of books and looking at the diffusion of the Reformation that thinks about year by year what is the competitive environment in every different city. Here we're looking at very large periods, like pre and post effectively. It's in taking the data at a very coarse level. It might be interesting in other dimensions to think about it much more finely, like at a level of industrial organization and competition. Okay. So I have 15 minutes, so let me accordingly sort of conclude the empirical section, where in scientific activity we see something roughly similar, that we see universities associated with more scientific activity in the sense of having scientists, and indeed more non-university scientists in the post-period. Now, this is again not definitive, but I would suggest to you it's at least consistent with there being spillovers in universities to the non-university sector. So this is sort of a bit in the flavor of Elizabeth Eisenstein's work, where she says like university professors and mechanics start thinking and acting together in new ways once the printing press has been established. You know, if this is your prediction about the world, you would expect there to be non-academic science in university towns. So like I happen to have grown up in Cambridge, Massachusetts. And Cambridge, Massachusetts has a ton of interesting like new startups right by MIT. It's like that could be your model of the world when you think about people who are doing research, publishing books, and engaged in scientific activity who are not themselves employed at a university. Okay, so more flexibly, you could, instead of thinking pre and post, let the data tell you when the changes in a variation occur. And you see that universities, courts, and indeed political fragmentation seem like they really start predicting increases in scientific activity like in the early 1500s. Okay, so not really in the late 1400s, but in the 1500s. Okay, so this, I've managed to get through this sufficiently that I can indulge myself with a few more like broad and I think historical and conceptual points. So the first is that printing changes the market for ideas. I don't think we think that this is surprising, but an interesting feature is that intellectual property rights are weak. This could mute the returns to authorship, but there are markets, notably where states and universities are employers, in which there is competition. So you could think about this as a potentially distorted market because of weak intellectual property rights that is being rescued by the presence of a second market. And this second market, like this is, I would get impassioned for a second. This second market is not in any conventional sense a capitalist market. This is not a capitalist labor market where these people are selling their labor, but it is certainly a competitive labor market in which states are buying science and scientific research. So it's a superstar effect with a bit of a twist. The printing does indeed activate, I would argue to you, two key features of the European economy. That it had these universities, that they had autonomy, that they were centers of intellectual activity, but previously weren't scientific centers. They were anti-empirical in large measure. I mean, that's a generalization, but in large measure. And they become scientific centered. And similarly, like the sort of political competition that we have in Europe is effectively the political competition of European feudalism. How did European feudalism's political competition start to support science? That's potentially tremendously interesting. Okay, so did printing really cause European science? There's a bunch of counterclaims that are about fixed factors. And so my question for all your fixed factor claims would be like, well, then why did salaries and scientific activity pick up after printing if these fixed factors were the key drivers? I'm not saying printing alone. It's printing in interaction with these potentially underlying factors. Similarly, you might be worried about time-varying factors. And then we want to think about, like, could it be Protestantism or religious competition? Is it the economic and political ascendancy of capitalists? Well, the timing here seems to, by and large, precede those things. Indeed, we see the salaries increase before the discovery of the Americas, which someone brought up. Okay, so because I have the incredible pleasure of being in Hong Kong, Joseph Needham. So those of you who read him, we have this conversation directly. Those of you who haven't read him, at least consider reading Needham. So Needham, as a good Marxist, made a set of strong claims about the role of the capitalist class and about the private sector in driving European science. He also made some less strong, more qualified claims, which aren't about like necessary conditions, but about co-occurrences. And he used this to try to think about how come Europe took off and outstripped China in technology and science, right? So his claim was like essentially a story of capitalist ascendancy. Like, I think what I'm offering you cuts a bit across that. Like, clearly, it is a story about a capitalist enterprise, for-profit printing, but it's how printing activated a set of markets and institutions that weren't really, in any clear sense, themselves originally capitalist. Okay, so hopefully I've given you some stuff on the timing and causes of the scientific revolution, which at least pays some attention to cause and effect, what we would think of as identification. In the spirit of Needham, like, I think, I mean, and maybe we want to think about what our technologies are doing today. Like, I don't know whether in economics we're allowed to think about modes of production anymore, or if this has become a taboo. But you have arguably the transition from feudalism to capitalism in Europe. And a key question is, how did this happen? And we have a capitalist industry transforming a number of feudal institutions in which states, as employers and funders of science, play a key role. Which, like, it's interesting to think about the markets that states support as against maybe markets that are private sector directly. And finally, like, knowledge as a public good actually emerges in this period. So if we go back to our undergrad textbooks, we think about like a Romer production function where everyone like produces knowledge with existing pools of knowledge. So the reality and indeed the cultural ideal of knowledge as a public good emerges in Europe in this period as people start to share. And one reason I'm going to suggest to you they start to share is because there are incentives to share. The incentive to share is that maybe I'll get a better job and a higher paycheck at another university. So that there is like a sort of incentives underlying story here. And finally, obviously, you know, we should acknowledge our colleagues who are less economistic and maybe in other disciplines. There are non-pecuniary rewards. Like, the only reason you do this is not just to make money. Presumably there is some fundamental human joy or perhaps pride in research. So that's what we have. Thanks, guys.
So what's the difference between modern science and traditional science if you target the rise of modern science, right?
Yeah, so that's a complicated and fraught question. So let me start with saying that I have used the term science somewhat instrumentally to describe knowledge activities that use evidence, so empirically based and to some extent testable, like criteria for making truth claims and understanding the natural world. Now, the truth is that historically people used words and cognates of the word science to describe many things, including like theological arguments. So there's like an etymological question as much as there is like this narrow like economics question. But pre-modern science did not have the same evidence-based emphasis. So like the role of evidence was transformed in this period. It would be like, I guess, my first high-level argument. It's a little bit testing, but not everything here is testing. Like, it's not all like our model of hypothesis testing formalized, although that starts to diffuse in this period. To some extent, it's also increasingly the mathematization of description. So in astronomy, certainly.
So related to the Columbus discovery of and also other factors. So instead of using the post-1473 dummy variable,
Yeah.
could you actually rely on regional variations? Because the printing press as you have shown in other papers, was adopted at different times, right? And also to different degrees.
Yeah.
So instead of relying on the post dummy, you could use the regional variations to maybe, separate the different impacts.
Yes. So I completely agree. So to some extent, the exercise looking at how far you are from mines embodies some of that spirit. Now, that's not directly testing regions, but it's imagining an effect that there's some gradient and that places close to where this technology emerged were more affected, and then asks, is it true that those places that were close and more affected differentially produce more science? And we find that that's the case. But I certainly agree. It's like regional factors could be, we could think about a number of ways to capture exactly what you're saying.
Are we monopolizing?
Are there some other entrants into the monopoly?
Okay, so I have a question that is definitely tangential to what you have presented. But since you have brought up Joseph Needham, so I guess I'll try to engage with you in this discussion. I think it is very inspiring to see you pointing out that property rights were actually weak in Europe at the time.
Yeah.
This is sort of like sort of contradicting the kind of Northian and other people in the institutional schools. And so I was thinking about the Chinese context, and to my knowledge, printing was already very well developed since the Song Dynasty. So with printing well developed in China, property rights being maybe weaker, maybe not too much weaker compared to Europe. So how are we going to make sense of this, so-called great divergence between Europe and China? So what other angles should we look at? Or printing is a big question.
Yeah.
Or, because printing in China was, being instrumentally geared towards the civil exam. They're publishing texts and books required, to be studied for the exam. Yeah. So, what's your sense?
Okay, so this is another question that one version is I decline to answer in face of the expertise assembled in the room. Another version is I offer a tentative and a modest answer.
Please.
So I guess I would be interested in what scholars here can document in coming years on the content of printing in the Chinese context and the factors that shaped the content. So the extent to which specific bodies of ideas were on either the supply or demand side promoted because of how they prepared people for the exam system or because of what their implications were politically. Okay, so I advertise my relative ignorance on that and curiosity. In terms of the great divergence, I think, at risk of restating what I've sort of said here, I think that the university system is special and unique and different. And one of the things that I've tried to emphasize, which maybe is not readily understood, is actually how competitive the university system is. A system with intense competition to try to gather students and professors, where these people were very mobile. And that had implications that essentially emerged when this new technology changed the formation of reputation. So my sense is that that is not closely analogous. And similarly, the nature of political competition. Needham's claim would have been the capitalists win in Europe. They create an institutional environment that's propitious for science. And indeed, science is, I didn't share with you a quote of Needham's where he says, science in Europe was in the main a private sector activity. I think that flatly this evidence indicates that that's not true. Science substantially was a state-driven activity. But the state was subject to market forces that may have been specific to Europe. And so like, there's a couple of dimensions where this is at odds, at least with like some forms of like idealized storytelling within economics, where we imagine markets in the private sector. Like there are markets here, but the private sector role is interesting. It's in the printing, it's in the media, and that disseminates celebrity and the product. But the payoff isn't actually principally in your book sales, because someone in like Shenzhen is going to pirate your book tomorrow and sell the entire market over there. You won't realize your royalties. So that's at least a start. Maybe, I mean, you can offer an answer to your own question.
Well, need to do more research.
Yeah.
Okay, so this has been a hugely inspiring seminar. So thanks once again,
Thank you
Jeremy,
all.
for
Thank you
his
for your
inspiring
questions.
talk. And thanks for attending.